kid, margarine was the latest craze. Butter was slandered for its high saturated fat content, and margarine took over the hearts of many. Then, it suddenly seemed that the public's view of margarine shifted, and butter became the preferred choice. The latest health trends leaning strongly towards natural and whole foods, the general public seems to be skeptical about margarine being a viable butter substitute. Some phrases that I commonly hear include, margarine is one molecule away from being plastic, or my personal favorite, a bear won't eat margarine, so I won't either. Out of my own curiosity, I wanted to see what registered dietitians thought. In speaking to a variety of dietitians and reading blogs by dietitians online, I found that there wasn't a clear consensus of what dietitians were recommending in regards to butter or margarine. So, I went on to try to find if butter or margarine was the better choice. Now, before I get started, it's important to note that I will not be considering partially hydrogenated margarines containing trans fats in this video. The evidence showing that trans fats are harmful to health is quite strong, and I've found that most dietitians accept this to be true. So, when I talk about margarines for the rest of the video, the margarines that I'm referring to are the ones that do not contain trans fats. Alright, let's talk about margarine. Margarine was originally created as a substitute for butter for the armed forces and lower classes. Margarine is a water and fat emulsion. The lipid phase is mainly made from refined vegetable oils such as cottonseed, palm, rapeseed, or olive oil. Depending on the type of margarine, the manufacturing process is different. Basically, the aqueous phase, or water-soluble phase, is mixed into the lipid phase at a specific temperature with continuous mixing. This mixture is then cooled and agitated to promote crystallization. The crystallized product is margarine. Now, let's talk about butter. Butter is made from buttercream, which comes from raw milk after the skim milk has been separated out. To make butter, buttercream is pasteurized and then churned. Churning causes butterfat molecules to clump together, forming butter. The clumps of butterfat molecules are then cut into desired shapes, wrapped, and sent out to be sold as butter. Let's begin our comparison by discussing saturated fats. Saturated fatty acids make up around 60% of the lipids found in butter, and about 19% of the lipids found in margarine. Early research, which included work by Ansel Keys, led to the conclusion that saturated fatty acids were considered to be hypercholesterolemic, thereby increasing the risk of cardiovascular disease. Along with this research came the finding that polyunsaturated fatty acids were considered to be hypocholesterolemic, and monounsaturated fats were neutral in their effect. Although this early research suggested that a switch of calories from saturated fats to polyunsaturated fats would be a wise choice to lower risk from cardiovascular disease, the recommendations only called for a reduction in saturated fats. Because the recommendations did not suggest where the replacing calories should come from, the intake of refined carbohydrates increased as the intake of saturated fats decreased, which is believed to have contributed to the increased rates of obesity and metabolic syndrome we see today. A recent Cochrane review of randomized controlled trials found that decreased intake of saturated fatty acids reduced risk of cardiovascular disease by 17%. Interestingly enough, there was no differences in the reduction of risk in healthy people compared to people who were already at risk for cardiovascular disease. Another thing that was found by the Cochrane review, which helps support earlier studies, is that the replacement of saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats was shown to be the most effective strategy for reducing risk of cardiovascular disease, suggesting that reducing saturated fat intake could be important for both people who are at risk of cardiovascular disease and people who are not at risk. In August 2015, the Heart and Stroke Foundation put out a position statement in which they suggested replacing saturated fats with mono and polyunsaturated fats with the aim of decreasing LDL. Although there is an association between saturated fat intake, increased serum LDL, and risk of cardiovascular disease, it is difficult to establish if saturated fat from dairy sources, including butter, is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. In the recent Heart and Stroke Foundation position statement I mentioned before, it was acknowledged that the health effects of saturated fats could vary based on the food in which the saturated fat originated from. Aside from the fatty acid discussion, I think it's valuable to touch on the processing of margarine. Margarine is an artificial product that contains more preservatives than butter and can contain more coloring and flavoring agents than butter. I have been unable to find data on the health effects of the processing of margarine. For some patients and clients, this aspect of margarine could be a concern, even if the ingredients of margarine are safe to consume. In a discussion I had with a dietitian regarding her recommendations of butter versus margarine, she told me that she likes to keep this in mind when she is counseling patients. Her rationale was that when she's seeing a patient who is adamant about eating a natural or whole food diet, recommending margarine to this patient may cause the dietitian to lose credibility. I thought that this was an interesting point to consider. Most Canadian diets, the major source of saturated fats, comes from processed foods like fast food, packaged snacks and sweets, and pre-prepared meals. Although butter is a source of saturated fat, it did not come up as one of the top foods that tends to contribute to high saturated fat intakes in Canada. Given the current recommendations, replacing butter with margarine may be beneficial to health, especially margarines that contain polyunsaturated fatty acids. I'm going to be honest with you and say that prior to making this video, my personal preference was for butter, which came down to two things. Number one, the taste. I prefer the taste of butter to margarine. Number two, the fact that butter was a little less processed than margarine. Before I started my research for this project, I had seen some headlines suggesting that saturated fats might not be as harmful as they originally thought. Because of that, I thought that making this video was going to validate my own feelings about butter being a better option than margarine. I also assumed I was going to have a more definitive answer about my question of butter versus margarine. I will say, after making this video, I am much more open to the idea of margarine as a butter substitute. The evidence does support that limiting saturated fats has shown to help lower cardiovascular disease risk, and this reduction of saturated fats should be accompanied by an increase in polyunsaturated fat intake. Therefore, it could be a sensible decision to switch from butter to a margarine that contains polyunsaturated fats. After doing my research, I feel like this topic is more controversial and less controversial than I originally anticipated. Let me explain. It's more controversial in the sense that the evidence does not 100% support the selection of either butter or margarine over the other, yet some dietitians still have very strong feelings that one of these is a better option over the other. It's less controversial in the sense that, realistically, I'm not sure if it actually matters if butter or margarine is better for you. As I mentioned earlier, butter did not come up as one of the top sources of saturated fats in the majority of Canadian diets. Given this information, I'm not convinced that pushing for a change to margarine from butter is really top priority for dietitians. Currently, many dietitians use the diet as a whole approach. I feel that looking at the diet as a whole may imply that deciding between a tablespoon of butter and a tablespoon of margarine might not really matter in the end. Rather, focusing more on fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and healthy sources of polyunsaturated fats may be a more beneficial use of time. In regards to saturated fats, HealthLink BC, Penn, UpToDate, and the Heart and Stroke Foundation have all changed their previous approach to focusing on individual fats to focusing on the diet as a whole. I look forward to seeing the future information studies bring to us and how this information influences recommendations. Until then, thanks for watching.